United States agencies and foreign countries need to take to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States. The vast majority of fentanyl and now other powerful synthetic opioids aren't being produced in the United States. These drugs come from international drug cartels. And we know that these cartels have international supply chains. Mexican drug cartels, for instance, order precursor chemicals used to make fentanyl or other synthetic opioids from chemical manufacturers in China. Then the cartels synthesize the opioids in Mexico and smuggle the drugs across the southwest border. U.S. and international authorities must work together to dismantle these transnational criminal organizations and cut off their supplies, their money, and illegal weapons. Today's hearing is an opportunity to look at the specific steps that Congress needs to take to disrupt the fentanyl supply chain and dismantle the deadly and violent criminal organizations that dominate this trade. And we need to develop these strategies with the understanding that the cartels are nimble, constantly shifting their methods to circumvent the law. We also need to recognize that these cartels take advantage of our current crisis at the southern border. So we need, urgently, to strengthen our defenses there. We should provide more resources to border agencies, hire more personnel, and deploy more equipment that can detect drugs in all kinds of vehicles. However, as I noted, to have a lasting impact on the flow of fentanyl into our country, we need to work with our international partners to fully dismantle the drug cartels producing and supplying the drugs. When I participated in a bipartisan congressional delegation to China last fall, I pressed President Xi to do more to stop the manufacturing and exportation of fentanyl precursor chemicals. President Biden held a summit with President Xi a month later, and since then the Chinese government has said that it would do more to crack down on drug trafficking and target the profits of illegal drug and precursor chemical exports. We have to hold China accountable and push them to implement reasonable, common-sense controls to limit illegal chemical exports. Yet China continues to resist calls to implement Know Your Customer protocols for its chemical sector. These protocols would require that companies verify that their customers have a legitimate purpose for dual-use chemicals and would make it much more difficult for drug cartels to purchase the chemicals that they need to make fentanyl. We must exert more diplomatic pressure to get this done, including working with other major Chinese trading partners to force changes. U.S. agencies should also take steps to improve coordination and information sharing with Mexican authorities. The drug cartels operating in Mexico are extremely powerful. Their dangerous influence has corrupted officials at all levels of government. In the face of these challenges, we have to find reliable partners to dismantle the drug cartels. One of the ways to dismantle and defeat the cartels is by depriving them of the money and illegal weapons that they smuggle across the southern border from the United States, something that Mexican officials have stressed to me in my 2 congressional trips there. Cartels use these weapons and money to seize control of Mexican communities and bribe or kill officials. That's why I've worked with Senator Langford to introduce the Enhancing Southbound Inspections to Combat Cartels Act. This bill requires that the Department of Homeland Security increase its inspections of vehicles and pedestrians traveling into Mexico. These inspections will help us prevent the flow of illicit money and weapons. The bill also authorizes additional resources for the border and law enforcement agencies that are responsible for inspections and investigations. I hope that the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee will consider this legislation soon. No one law will address the fentanyl crisis alone. Fentanyl is inexpensive to make and transport, and it is in high demand. It will continue to take an all-hands-on-deck approach to dismantle the cartels, crack down on the spread of illicit fentanyl, and protect our communities. That's why, while we work to combat the cartels, we should also take steps to strengthen resources for people dealing with addiction to make sure that anyone who needs treatment and recovery services can access them. Today, though, I look forward to discussing how we can disrupt fentanyl supplies and dismantle drug cartels with our 3 insightful witnesses. People in every corner of the country, including my home state of New Hampshire, have had their families and communities destroyed by the fentanyl crisis. We must do everything that we can to dismantle and defeat the cartels. We cannot relent in these efforts. We need to build a safer future for our country and for our children. Thank you, and I now recognize Ranking Member Romney for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Hassan, for holding this hearing. I appreciate those of you who are here today to educate us and inform us as to what steps might be taken to reduce the tragedy of fentanyl in our country and, frankly, globally. I don't have to recount to you the statistics. Even in my state of Utah, the numbers between 2019 and 2020 showed fentanyl-linked deaths increased by 128%. It continues to be a human tragedy across our country and across the world. And the question is, what can we do? Is there any one place, any choke point we can focus on and say, if we can just get this group here or this country here to take the following steps, well, then we're going to be able to dramatically reduce the tragedy of fentanyl. China has made commitments, as the chair indicated, and I don't believe they fully lived up to those commitments. Had there been the same kind of concern about fentanyl in China as there is here in the U.S., my expectation is that there had been a much tougher approach taken there. That hasn't happened, and I'm interested in your perspective on whether there's prospect for that occurring in the future. Likewise, with regards to Mexico, we have not had as much support in fighting organized crime and the cartels in Mexico as we might have hoped. A new administration suggests that we'll have a better relationship and perhaps more ability to make a difference there. But I guess we're all recognizing what the problem is. We just don't know how to solve it. And you have experience in this regard that we would consider highly valuable. That's why we decided to hold this hearing. We want to hear your perspectives and potentially see what you think as well about the legislation which Senator Langford and Senator Hassan have proposed, and see if there are other steps that you think we might take to make it more likely that we will be able to restrict the scourge of fentanyl. With that, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Romney. It is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if you will all please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you all. Please be seated. Our first witness today is Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown, right? Dr. Felbab-Brown is the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors at the Brookings Institute. She is an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. Dr. Felbab-Brown has conducted extensive fieldwork and research around the world, including throughout Latin America and South Asia. Welcome, Dr. Felbab-Brown. You are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair Hassan, Ranking Member Romney, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am honored to have this opportunity to testify on these crucial issues. My testimony...
Pull the microphone a little closer to you.
And then aim it at your...
Is it better now?
Right into your...
Okay.
Right there.
Yeah. Are you getting it? Okay. Thank you. So, Chair Hassan, Ranking Member Romney, thank you very much for this opportunity to testify today. My testimony represents solely my views. As you have said in your opening statements, the fentanyl crisis is a massive crisis. It is the most lethal drug epidemic ever in history, even while it is confined to North America. It has significant potential to spread beyond North America. U.S. domestic, evidence-based prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and law enforcement remain crucial and indispensable for addressing it. But supply measures also matter. They can save lives. Mexico and China are key actors in whose collaboration is necessary for controlling supply. Yet the United States has found it challenging and difficult to have meaningful cooperation with either country. China is the principal source of precursor chemicals today, from which Mexican cartels are synthesizing fentanyl in Mexico and then smuggling it to the United States. China subordinates its counter-narcotics cooperation to its strategic calculus and to its bilateral relationships. Between August 2022 and November 23, we had no meaningful cooperation from China. adroit U.S. diplomacy. Thank you, Senator Hassan, for your role in engaging Beijing, as well as Beijing's own calculus that it wanted to stabilize the bilateral relationship were the critical reasons why China agreed to resurrect cooperation. China has already taken some steps. It has sent out notices to Chinese pharmaceutical companies that it will start monitoring and likely enforcing the sales of precursors. We had the meetings in Beijing of the bilateral US-China working group on counter-narcotics, in which China agreed to two important issues. Collaboration on anti-money laundering. This is the first time that China has agreed to do so in the bilateral relationship, and also acting against the sales of pill presses. But as you have said, there are many issues that are outstanding, and the robustness of the cooperation is yet to be seen. China is already indicating that it might not be able to move to prosecutions and arrests because many of the precursors are dual-used and not scheduled. Yet certainly when companies sell to Mexican criminal actors, giving them recipes how to synthesize, there are opportunities to charge on material support, fraud, or conspiracy charges. Also, the extent of the anti-money laundering cooperation remains to be seen, but is crucial, as Chinese money launderers have become the to-go actors for Mexican cartels and some of the world's leading ones, and use methods that are difficult for law enforcement to deal with. Know your customer laws, as you have also said, is absolutely crucial. We need to continue encouraging China to adopt and enforce them, and developing a subgroup within the global coalition against the threat of synthetic drugs that the United States launched last summer is an opportunity to do so. The relationship with Mexico also remains deeply challenged. Mexico essentially acts sporadically and often inconsistently against Mexican cartels broadly and against the flows of fentanyl. Its cooperation is centered on occasional high-value targeting, and as a result of US prodding and brave journalistic investigative work, the Mexican government did shut down some of the pharmacies in Mexico that sell fentanyl and meth-laced drugs, a very significant and dangerous vector of addiction and death. However, more broadly, robust investigations and network dismantling are not taking place in Mexico. Investigative work by Reuters has repeatedly shown that the Mexican government systematically and grossly exaggerates the extent to which it busts labs. There is often little support from the Mexican government for journalists, honest Mexican government officials, brave civil society actors who are willing to stand up to the cartels. And in fact, in a very troubling recent development, we have seen President López Obrador releasing the personal information of New York Times bureau chief in Mexico City with very dangerous consequences. The US government should take actions to make sure that such behavior is not repeated. Violence in Mexico remains high and brazen and is spreading geographically, affecting every life of people in Mexico. The current election season is likely the most violent one. Mexican criminal groups are taking over legal economies and public services. They are governing an expanding scope of territories, economies, and institutions and people in Mexico, even as the Mexican government remains unwilling to tackle them in any systematic manner and take law enforcement action against them. And these pernicious developments raise significant questions about nearshoring to Mexico as a strategy of de-risking from China. In my written statement, I offer a detailed set of recommendations that I am glad to discuss with you subsequently. Let me just say at the end that since Mexican cartels have greatly diversified their portfolio, they are involved in many illegal economies, they are increasingly paying for precursor chemicals in wildlife products, it is important to tackle all the economic activity of those actors, not simply fentanyl flows. It is imperative to also tackle all their connections to criminal actors elsewhere in China and their political patrons around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Our next witness is Selena Realula. Ms. Rula is the professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National Defense University. She previously served in the State Department, including as the director of State's Counterterrorism Finance Program. Ms. Rula has over 2 decades of international experience in the public, private, and academic sectors. Welcome. You are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Hassan, Ranking Member Romney, and members of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Spending Oversight of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs for this opportunity to testify on strengthening international cooperation to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States. 1 year ago, I testified before the House Financial Services Committee on how China and the Mexican cartels are waging an asymmetrical war against the U.S. through the international illicit fentanyl trade. Unfortunately, the fentanyl crisis has just gotten worse since then. Over 112,000 U.S. overdose deaths in 2023 are mostly attributed to illicit fentanyl from the Mexican cartels that source the fentanyl, precursor chemicals, and pill presses from China. The cartels and their Chinese suppliers are exploiting America's weaknesses, namely our appetite for illicit drugs and porous borders. In the last year, we've actually seen increased efforts to curb international intel and more importantly, the fentanyl flows with this cooperation with China and Mexico. But we must trust but verify to see how deep that commitment is in order to tackle this deadly epidemic in the long run. On the Chinese front, we actually saw, after a long period of suspended cooperation, Presidents Biden and Xi decided to resume bilateral narcotics enforcement when they met in San Francisco in November. Just before that meeting, the PRC submitted 145 drug-related incidents to the International Narcotics Control Board database, and this is the first time that China had done so since 2017. Beijing has also warned domestic precursor producers of potential legal action if their chemicals are sent abroad. While these are positive development, it remains to be seen how the PRC can crack down on illicit fentanyl suppliers and the money launderers to have a true impact on the global supply chain. On the Mexican front, after a long period of strained relations since AMLO took power in 2018, the U.S. and Mexico renewed cooperation through the Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities in October 2021. It addresses the production, trafficking, consumption, and financing of illicit drugs and firearms. In January 2023, at the North America Leaders Summit, Mexican President AMLO acknowledged fentanyl production in Mexico and pledged to interdict precursor chemicals and destroy fentanyl labs. As fentanyl-related deaths due to domestic consumption in Mexico and cartel-related homicides are on the increase, we could expect the Mexican government to be more inclined to cooperate with the United States on the fentanyl issue. When we look forward, we have to think about how the U.S., China, and Mexico must intensify domestic and international efforts against the illicit fentanyl trade by reducing drug demand and supply, increased narcotics detection and interdiction, and anti-money laundering measures. Here on the domestic front, we should assign more human, financial, technology resources to disrupt fentanyl flows. And this would include more inspection scanners, forward operating labs, and the use of AI on our borders. We also need to encourage U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies to leverage signals, financial, and digital intelligence to better understand how these traffickers are operating in what we call the cyber-physical realm, particularly on online markets. On the international front, we should set up specialized units that share specific law enforcement information with the PRC and Mexico to take down the Chinese-Mexican criminal networks engaged in the drug trade. And the U.S. should hold the PRC accountable for the export of illicit fentanyl and precursor chemicals and demand verifiable reports of actions that they've taken against these traffickers. If the PRC should decide not to demonstrate good faith, the U.S. should consider punitive measures like threatening the withdrawal of most favored nation status, imposing actual tariffs, and applying diplomatic pressure through the global coalition to address synthetic drug threats. On the financial front, which is an area that I've been studying for 20 years, we should really press the PRC to go after the money runners and ensure that they apply know your customer to the suppliers, but also those who finance them. On the Mexican front, we need to deepen true cooperation in terms of the production, trafficking, and money laundering elements of the entire business cycle of the illicit fentanyl trade. And if Mexico does not cooperate and show credible action, we should consider designating the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. This would provide USG agencies with expanded powers to pursue and freeze assets of the cartels and their collaborators under the Material Support of Terrorism statute. In conclusion, illicit fentanyl producers, traffickers, and their financiers are exploiting increased demand, porous borders, and cyberspace to further expand their operations around the world, well beyond just Canada and the United States. Therefore, with China and Mexico, we need to double down on cooperative measures to stem the flow of illicit fentanyl that is literally killing tens of thousands of Americans. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our third witness is Christopher Urban. Mr. Urban is Managing Director in Nardello & Company's Washington, D.C. office. Before his current role, Mr. Urban served for 25 years with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, leading sophisticated international money laundering and threat finance investigations. This included overseas tours in Brussels and Copenhagen, and also time with the Special Operations Division in the U.S., where he focused on international threats. Welcome, Mr. Urban. You're recognized for your opening statement.
Chair Hassan and Ranking Member Romney and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today on the importance of international cooperation in combating the international trade of fentanyl. This growing trade has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, destabilized Mexico, and adversely affected our nation's communities and its financial integrity. International cooperation, particularly with Mexico and China, can help stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States and the flow of narcotics proceeds through our financial system. I saw firsthand the damage done by the international trade of narcotics, including fentanyl, during my 24-year career as an agent and executive with the DEA. I started off on the front lines targeting leaders of transnational organized criminal organizations who are trafficking drugs into the U.S. and laundering crime proceeds through our institutions. I also spent time abroad at U.S. embassies in Brussels and Copenhagen, working with our partners to increase collaboration against transnational organized crime. In 2018, I was assigned to DEA's Special Operations Division, SOD, where I supervised a team that focused on a new and evolving threat: Chinese money launderers, CMLOs, and other elements of Chinese organized crime globally. Over the course of my career with DEA, I observed the transformative potential of international cooperation in achieving our mission and increasing global stability. One example of this potential is Plan Colombia. The U.S. Colombian Initiative launched in 2000. At the time Plan Colombia was started, the country was struggling with cartel-initiated violence and battling insurgencies from the AUC and the FARC. As a result of decades of hand-in-hand partnership with the U.S. and Colombian authorities, which included extensive work with the DEA and trusted Colombian counterparts, and intensive investigative techniques by both, and the extradition of high-level narcotics traffickers to the U.S. to face justice, a very important component to that, the country has been transformed into a solid long-term partner of the U.S. in combating the global narcotics trade. During my work in Brussels and Copenhagen, I collaborated extensively with European counterparts, some of which were young democracies that had been under the control of the Soviet Union, and I collaborated on significant criminal and national security issues. When I returned to the U.S. and SOD after my time abroad, I saw the profound negative effect of the lack of effective international cooperation and the dramatic increase of fentanyl into the country, and also the increased monies being laundered by CMLOs. Lack of international cooperation with China on counter-narcotics issues has enabled fentanyl precursor chemicals manufactured in that country to be transported to Mexico, where they have been transformed into drugs that are killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. Lack of collaboration with China on anti-money laundering issues has contributed to the rise of CMLOs as the primary vehicle through which Mexican drug cartels are laundering their money. The CMLO model is a dramatic improvement for the Mexican cartels. Several aspects of the CMLO threat could be addressed much more effectively if U.S. and Chinese law enforcement and financial regulators were able to work together. For example, CMLOs utilize technology to their advantage. WeChat transmissions are resistant to surveillance by U.S. law enforcement. They can't be used to disrupt the CMLOs or bring their leadership, the organized crime leadership, to justice. However, Chinese authorities who have access to WeChat and other Chinese communication tools could share information on the CMLO activity with U.S. law enforcement if the two countries were collaborating effectively. Our relationship with Mexico on these issues is stronger, but there is a tremendous need for improvement and a reset. In 2021, the governments of Mexico and U.S. announced the new framework and cooperation plan, the Bicentennial Framework. This agreement seeks to reopen and improve bilateral channels to address drug trafficking, organized crime, facilitate extraditions, and stem the flow of fentanyl into the United States. But the key is a dramatic improvement in joint operations between Mexican and U.S. law enforcement, and that Mexican honor all U.S. extradition requests in a timely manner. That would be a game changer. The private sector can also help. At Nardello & Co., the global investigative firm that I joined in 2022, we are working on ways to help financial institutions to identify and address the CMLO activity by shutting down accounts and reporting suspicious activity to the authorities. If done on a global scale, CMLOs and other money launderers, it would be much more difficult for them to move the money. Finally, the U.S., we could do more to combat the flow of fentanyl into this country through new laws and additional resources. Thank you to the subcommittee for calling attention to this important issue. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm going to go ahead with my set of questions, then I'll turn it over to the ranking member, and other members I think are going to come in and out as they can. Mr. Urban, I want to start with a question to you. Last year, when I traveled to China and met with President Xi, I pushed him to crack down on the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals that drug cartels order from Chinese businesses. Following up on that meeting, President Biden and President Xi agreed to more extensive cooperation to stop the trafficking of fentanyl and fentanyl precursor chemicals from China to Mexico. Now we need to ensure that China keeps its commitment to work with us. What tangible steps should the U.S. require from China in, let's say, the next 6 months and in the next 2 years?
So when the government as China has acted in the past, we have seen results that have been favorable in terms of the trafficking patterns of actual fentanyl that was coming in 2018 and 19. In terms of the precursors coming from Chinese multinational companies and supplying the cartels, I would ensure through meetings with U.S. law enforcement, U.S. officials, and Chinese officials with those chemical companies that they're enhancing their KYC to Western standards. We should ensure that these meetings take place to see that it's actually happening. The other component to that, as we attack the precursor network and the flow of those chemicals, we should see, obviously, a decrease. The other aspect of this is the Mexican cartels, if the Chinese are stopping the precursors coming from China, will have to seek other sources of supply. They will have to go elsewhere. So that is what would be a dramatic step. That would be a hopeful step. The other part of this that I want to see within the United States is our capability to act ourselves. It's an opportunity to work with the Chinese to see this happen, but if they don't, we should place these chemical companies on what I call the pre-sanction list and have a discussion with these Chinese authorities and give them the opportunity to act. And if they don't, then sanction the chemical company and do it ourselves.
Thank you. Dr. Felbab-Brown, in the last few years, Chinese criminal organizations have taken over the vast majority of money laundering for drug cartels. This criminal activity is driven by huge demand in China to illegally convert Chinese currency into U.S. dollars due to strict capital controls put in place by the Chinese government. How can the U.S. best combat the money laundering by Chinese organizations that enable the drug cartels?
Well, there is no simple answer. The underground banking system that you are referring to is only one of the methods that Chinese money launderers are using. They are also using trade-based methods, increasingly even in the United States, real estate and cashier's check. Detection, sting operations are all important elements of identifying the tools they are resorting to. Obviously, know your customers' laws also have benefits in providing intelligence on dismantling the money laundering networks. Insisting on better monitoring within the Chinese banking sector is another important step. One of the positive things that happened in Beijing at the US-China Counter-Narcotics Working Group meeting was that for the first time, representatives from Chinese banks, including the Bank of China, were part of side meetings. So there are many opportunities to act, many challenges in the way that the Chinese money launderers are laundering money. Many of those are mirror transactions in the three countries, China, Mexico, United States, where the money never crosses international border, no international wires. That limits the opportunities. But the less cooperation we have from China, the less we are able to act. But I agree that we can continue strengthening our own money laundering efforts. A lot of the focus has been on bulk cash moving across the US-Mexico border. Frankly, that's an outdated method of money laundering. Other channels are far more potent and carrying far greater flows today.
Thank you. Another question for you, Doctor. In negotiations with the United States, China has frequently claimed that they cannot disrupt the trade of fentanyl precursors since they can't distinguish illegal shipments from normal commerce. Know your customer laws, where sellers are required to confirm the legitimacy of their buyers, would help identify illegal trade. But China has so far refused to adopt these protocols. How can the U.S. further pressure China to implement these requirements?
I think there are multiple steps that the United States could take. Know your customers law are common practice around the world, way outside of simply the pharmaceutical industry. If China continues to insist that they are too expensive to adopt, China should feel the economic consequences of not adopting them. This would include preventing market access by Chinese companies, sanctioning some Chinese companies, placing them on either sanctions or pre-sanctions list, as my fellow witness suggested, or taking other measures. Developing portfolios of leverage, visa denial on key industry operatives, key industry officials, for example, is one opportunity. And shaming China. China is responsive to shaming. Yeah. It is a country that prides itself as being the world's toughest drug cop. The synthetics, the coalition against the threat of synthetic drugs that the United States launched and that China abstained from was a powerful tool. There are opportunities to build more leverage, more effects within the coalition so China becomes responsive.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that just a second and then turn to Senator Romney. How would the U.S. benefit from creating a more global approach to disrupting the fentanyl supply chain? More specifically, would the cooperation of Australian authorities and other Southeast Asian nations force China to take more concrete actions?
I think it is important to expand the work of the coalition on synthetic threats broadly, and this is indeed how the coalition has been constructed, because in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific region so far, we are not seeing significant fentanyl threat. But there is an immense methamphetamine threat that is linked to China. Chinese criminal networks are the principal vectors, traffickers of methamphetamine. And China is very responsive to countries in Southeast Asia, including in terms of law enforcement cooperation. It also uses law enforcement cooperation for its influence. So enhancing specifically that sub-coalition that you refer to, Southeast Asian countries, Australia, New Zealand, is in my view a very effective tool to motivate further action and consistent action from China.
Thank you very much. Senator Romney.
Thank you. I'm going to step back because I'm not an expert in this topic at all, and I've not spoken with Chairman Xi about it, nor even Mexican authorities about it. So I'm going to ask just very simply, and I'm going to ask each of you, where you think our focus ought to be most directed, or whether we can have a focus. So it strikes me that there are various elements where we have pressure or capacity to constrain. There's the demand side, which is trying to influence demand for narcotics and fentanyl in the U.S. That strikes me as a very difficult task to take on, finding a way to reduce demand in the U.S. But that's one possibility. The next is the border, which is to make a very aggressive effort to secure the border electronically with monitoring systems to evaluate what's coming across the border. And the reason I think it's difficult is because it can come, of course, by people carrying product over. It's not a very heavy product. It's small. It can come in through the mail. It can come by aircraft. It can come by ship. So the border strikes me as a very difficult one to substantially restrict the flow. Then there are the cartels. Going after the cartels. Ending organized crime is something we've been trying to do since the 1930s or probably before that. And so I wonder whether we're going to be able to stop organized crime in Mexico. The next one is precursors, going after the precursors that are coming from China. And I don't know how easy it is to make the precursor, how effective China might be in cutting off the development precursor. Then we go on to money laundering and the financial systems to try and cut off financial systems. It would seem to me as a novice in this area that if someone's willing to pay you money and someone's willing to get paid that money, they're going to find a way to launder it. And we can try and stop all sorts of vehicles to make it easy, but ultimately buyers and sellers are going to be able to complete a transaction. So as I look at those, I wonder which are the ones we should focus on? What's the one or two that is going to be most effective in being able to reduce the scourge of fentanyl in our country? And I'll start in the center here with Ms. Realuyo. All right, I'm getting close to that. What is the origin of that name?
Filipino.
Filipino, all right. Excellent. Please, do you have a thought on that?
Sure. So you've actually taken a look at the entire business cycle. As we were taught at Harvard Business School, you got to figure out how your efficiencies are. One of the greatest challenges is the actual effectiveness in terms of addiction of the pill, as well as the profit margin. So one of the estimates now is that it costs 30 cents in a Mexican lab to produce a fentanyl-laced pill that is being sold in Navy Yard right in front of the Nats Stadium at $10 to $15 to $20 here in the DC area. So that's already a very hefty, that's a reason to now switch to synthetic drugs if you're a trafficker, and then also it's harder to detect. And our DEA colleagues know this, as opposed to other plant-based drugs that have scents, so like heroin, marijuana, or cocaine. But I still think we need to come back to, which is not really the topic of, it's the demand. And we're about to enter in prom season here in the United States, and there are tremendous campaigns like One Pill Can Kill, which is done by the DEA. Every one of us as members of our community need to impress upon our youth, and then more importantly, how deadly these things that you're ordering online. So I've been looking at the digitalization of illicit networks, and more importantly, in the cyber-physical domain. So all these things that we talk about that are criminal networks, they now have a parallel market off the internet. And a lot of it has to do with these social media platforms where they literally, young people, exchange with a trafficker. There's no words. It's just the use of emojis and amounts and numbers. So it's their own language, but more importantly, we as parents and as educators are not watching what our kids are doing online. And then the drug gets sent or gets actually physically exchanged at the parking lot or the McDonald's next to the high school. So we still need to go to the demand piece. And I think raising awareness and looking at the prevention part and treatment part are very important. Obviously, our hearing today is looking at the supply piece, where I also think, having been a former banker at Goldman Sachs, plucked out by General Powell to come and fight the war on terror financially, we can use the exact same toolkit to actually constrain. And my colleagues have talked about the developments of the Chinese money laundering organizations. They really rely on this technology platform like WeChat. Just as we all transfer money on Zelle or PayPal or Venmo, they have Venmo for all these types of illicit activity. And the other thing we didn't talk about was the use of cryptocurrencies. So we're starting to see the Jalisco cartel, very sophisticated out of the Guadalajara area, starting to use what are called virtual wallets. They'll pay young people to set up a wallet to load dollars here in the US in Bitcoin or Ethereum or some form of, and then they take the pesos out in ATMs in Mexico. And there's an area where we can put and impart on our foreign counterparts methods and means of imposing more controls on what I call the cyber-physical world of how these groups are circumventing what I call traditional law enforcement and regulatory kind of policies in order to go after the money, but also the demand.
Thank you. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rosen.
Well, Thank you, Chair Hassan, Ranking Member Romney. This is a really, really important hearing, and thank you for graciously allowing me to ask the first set of questions. This is a critically important topic, and the fentanyl crisis, like you all say, we all know this. It's devastating. It's devastating in my home state of Nevada, communities all across Nevada. The Southern Nevada Health District reported in February of this year that between 2020 and 2023, the number of fentanyl overdoses among residents of Clark County, our largest county in Nevada, is increased by 97%. 97%. It's one of the reasons why earlier this year I returned to the southern border to meet with Border Patrol and CBP to find out really what those law enforcement officers need to help stop the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. And since returning, I'm really proud to have passed bipartisan legislation to address the fentanyl crisis, voting for increased investments in technologies that help and intercept drugs. But as to what you've alluded to, much more work needs to be done. And so I want to talk a little bit about sea. We know we have the border, but we have the sea. So last week, I sit on Armed Services at an Armed Services Committee hearing. Southcom Commander Richardson, the general, he discussed our armed services' ability to detect and seize maritime drug shipments. They're coming in that way, too. She said that even with intelligence cooperation with partner nations, they're only able to seize about 10% of drug shipments coming in by sea. So, Ms. Realuo, what steps can we use or to better equip our service members and DHS personnel to stop the flow of fentanyl? And also, how can we leverage our international partners to prevent that from coming here like we need to do with defense?
So particularly in terms of maritime routes, we can use a lot of what we call actionable intelligence. My colleague, Christopher Urban, talked about Plan Colombia. We've developed over 20 years of real knowledge on how to intersect and, more importantly, intercept through international trafficking routes. And that really is dependent on international cooperation, which is the topic of today's piece. How do we build those trusted networks is a bigger challenge. I think you know it's not a secret that we've had a lot of challenges working with Mexico on counter-narcotics due to corruption, to the extent that we actually arrested the top general who was implicated for just a couple weeks, Cienfuegos. So the bigger question is, how do we educate also our own law enforcement, military, and intelligence officers to understand those patterns very well. So with Homeland Security, there are trade transparency units that work against trade-based money laundering. The question is, how can we create? We have a system out of Southcom that General Richardson oversees, which is the Joint Interagency Task Force South, looking at now all illicit trafficking, not just cocaine, which had traditionally been looking at it. It's also looking at all types of things, contraband, people, money. So the question then is, how do we build that to be a broader kind of model to go after all the ports of entry, whether they be by land, sea, or now air? Because I think you've heard about the drones now that are crossing and dropping payloads. And these are the things that we need to really impress upon how we can keep abreast of all this emerging technology. So I look at emerging technology from the dark side of globalization. How is AI, for example, or how our drones are being abused and then more importantly exploited for the bad as opposed to the good. And we've seen the Mexican cartels very, very adroit at incorporating new technologies like crypto payments, like drones to surveil, figuring out where are the kind of weaknesses on our border, Nevada, Arizona. And they're quite smart in the way they apply it. But the bigger thing is how could we keep abreast, and that has to do a lot with resources. Keeping our analysts really up to date with how new technology is being applied by the criminal cartels.
Well, I appreciate you thinking about all of that because they're going to try to stay one step ahead of us, and our job is to try to think, maybe outthink them and to try to get one step ahead of them. But you talked about educating, and we do need to educate our law enforcement. So that fentanyl guidance for law enforcement, of course, this week the President signed into law the End Fentanyl Act, that bipartisan legislation I co-led with Senator Scott and Chair Hassan. And this new law is going to help crack down on drug smuggling, requiring CBP to update its outdated guidance more frequently so that CBP officers can have more information on how to better handle this. As you said, they're constantly coming up with new ways to get these drugs in. So again, how can we be sure that how other nations are up to date? Are they up to date on their fentanyl guidance documents for their law enforcement personnel? And then to Mr. Urban, our drug enforcement personnel in Mexico, China, and other countries, are they receiving that proper training? So,
So I work actually at the Perry Center, where we are an arm of the Defense Department, and through education and academic engagements, we try to share and, more importantly, export our best practices. I just finished a course for 46 mid-level to senior law enforcement and policy and military officers from 16 countries. So the idea is to understand, now they were taught what the fentanyl threat that's coming to their countries. And I think you know that they've found fentanyl now in Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, and Costa Rica. So it's not just the United States and Canada facing this. So the big question is, how do you build that trust with your partner? And I know I also work with U.S. Northern Command and Army North, and we're doing a lot of what we call confidence-building exercises where we actually show, and you'd be pleased to hear that the U.S. military and law enforcement are actually teaching the Mexican counterparts how to handle fentanyl. So I don't know if you realize also we are not using canine units to the extent possible because the drug is so powerful on a human being, it actually overwhelms the canines who are quite valuable in terms of these things. But for example, maybe the Mexicans didn't know that until they attended the training. Right. So these are the types of ways that day by day at the tactical and operational level, there are actually quite good relations. The bigger question is, how do we get to the political will at the strategic level to see eye to eye and understand that the threat of fentanyl is killing not just Americans, but Mexicans as well. And that's coming around, I hope.
Thank you. Mr. Urban, do you want to talk about the international cooperation, make sure they're receiving some of this training?
Sure. So like I mentioned earlier, I was overseas for 10 years. So with DEA, whether it's DEA, HSI, FBI, we develop relationships with our counterparts. And certainly over the last few years, that intelligence, that training, that information has certainly been pushed out to the field where we've trained our foreign counterparts. For example, I was in Vietnam and talked about this very issue with my foreign counterparts. Mm-hmm. What we're very good at in DEA is certainly pushing out the international training component. So I'm very confident that that's happened over the last few years in terms of building capacity and their awareness of how dangerous fentanyl is and being trained on how to handle it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Langford.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you, expertise that you're bringing. Can I ask just a broad question? What other nations are dealing with the fentanyl use like we are? It's such an incredibly inexpensive drug to be able to produce. Obviously, it's killing 100,000 Americans now. We're seeing what other nations are dealing with the drug addiction issues that we're dealing with right now for fentanyl specifically.
Well, currently, Mexico, even though Mexican President López Obrador continues to deny that fentanyl is used in Mexico, and Canada, which has some of the same death rates as the United States. Fentanyl is also used in parts of Europe, Estonia, where it's been a long-established market, and various fentanyl amounts have popped up around other parts of Europe, like Nordic countries. The bigger issue in Europe currently is other type of synthetic opioids, so-called nitazines. Fentanyl has been seized in various other parts of the world, but part of the challenge of answering your question, Senator Langford, is that very many countries do not, in fact, monitor either the flows or the use of fentanyl. So there might be much more than is known.
Right. So for the countries that have been successful in trying to be able to deter fentanyl use in their country, what have they found to be successful?
So I think there are, the sole case of success are the Nordic countries about a decade and a half ago, where fentanyl was showing up in Norway, in Finland, around 2005, 2006, 2007. This was before fentanyl became a mainstream drug and because the ease of production was significantly simplified. At the time, the Nordic countries were able to very rapidly dismantle fentanyl supplying networks.
How?
They did investigations and arrested the entire network that was bringing it in. But those networks were small, marginal. They were not networks with the power, the extent of Mexican cartels that are robustly establishing operations around Europe these days, or the diversification and scale of Chinese criminal networks. It was very different days than they are right now.
Obviously, the technologies, thank you, by the way, the technologies increased for detection of fentanyl, but we're still not there to have a visual spectral analysis to be able to pick it up, to be able to evaluate that. As far as the movement of technology, Senator Hassan and I have continued to be able to work on outbound inspection to try to pick up guns and drugs heading south, or guns and cash, I guess, heading south, and then also the inbound. It's my understanding we've got about $300 million worth of non-intrusive inspection equipment sitting in a warehouse, waiting for Congress to be able to finish out the allocation of the dollars to actually install it. I'm sure that will make a difference for us. But as far as inspection equipment and locations for that, or new types of technology for detecting it, what are we seeing at this point? Both handheld that could be used by local law enforcement or at a border. Are we seeing anything?
So there's been a dramatic improvement in terms of detection, in terms of handheld, and at the border. It just needs to be deployed but deployed on both sides of the border to detect the fentanyl coming in, right? So there's another component of Mexico where we need to build up capacity there. But within the United States, there has been an improvement in terms of technology. It just needs to be purchased, trained, and delivered to the field. Every field officer or investigator that has to deal with this issue on a narcotics unit should have a handheld detector so they know what they're dealing with. But in terms of Mexico itself, if I could digress, I mean, there needs to be a dramatic improvement in terms of resources down there, and you could push those resources out there as well to impact the fentanyl trade.
Resources are one thing, the personnel to actually run it and that are trusted partners to be able to do that in those areas, that's something very different.
It's something very different, and from my perspective, and Senator Romney brought this up, in terms of organized crime, it needs to be the goal of the United States to take down the Mexican cartels. And the reason I say that is the only way we're going to actually win this battle against fentanyl is to go after the Mexican cartels. There is an opportunity with new leadership coming in Mexico. We need to go back to Plan Colombia and what has demonstrated success. It's not going to be easy, but the things that I would suggest are, one, vetted units. We need to build up the capacity of Mexico and our joint operations within the United States to go after the cartels. So there should be a collaborative relationship. They're an ally of ours. We share a border with them. We have tremendous trade with them, so we should commit to this relationship. And there are new things we do, not just with vetted units in Mexico, but things called joint investigative teams, where we work collaboratively in the United States with officials from other countries. They do this in Europe a lot, and again, we should fully commit to that. The second part is extraditions. We can do this tomorrow, and this would have a dramatic impact on Mexican cartel members. We have a treaty with Mexico. They should honor our extradition requests, and that would have a dramatic impact. I could go on and on to different ideas, but building up that capacity and committing to it would make a big difference.
There's been some push for additional authority to be able to sanction individuals in these cartels. You're also talking about extradition. We need the additional authorities to be able to pass for the sanctions authorities, but what authorities already exist that are not currently being used?
So the last sanction order, the executive order that the Biden administration came out with, it's a low threshold to sanction individuals and companies that are facilitators of the fentanyl trade. Right. That's what I talked about earlier in terms of standing up a sanctions platform to go after whether it's Chinese chemical companies or any facilitator in Mexico. And if we can't impact them with arrest and extradition, just frankly sanction them. It's a good use of time and money.
Criminal consequences here for those that are trafficking in fentanyl. Is there a need to be able to increase consequences, obviously on the federal level for trafficking across the border, or to be able to hold people greater to account if there is a death from fentanyl, to be able to trace that back to everyone in the chain of distribution?
So absolutely. Everyone should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, from the death back to the source of supply. We should be using the racketeering laws that we have, that when we went after Italian organized crime, we should be going after Chinese organized crime that's operating in this country.
Is that happening right now?
No.
Yeah. I mean,
it should happen.
That's one of the concerns that I have, is that it should have. Those are authorities that currently exist right now, that if you've got the death of a 25-year-old based on a fentanyl use of something they thought was an Oxycontin, was actually had fentanyl laced in it, death of that individual, being able to track back all the distribution to the beginning.
So there have been prosecutions on exactly what you're saying. There needs to be more, because every death that's a result of drugs trafficked from the Mexican cartel should result in one of those prosecutions.
Okay, thank you.
I am briefly assuming the duties of the chair while Chair Hassan votes. Professor Realio, Chair Hassan and I helped to lead a bipartisan delegation to Beijing last fall. And our bipartisan delegation unanimously and with force raised directly with President Xi our insistence that China take stronger action to end the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals from China's chemical manufacturing sector onward, much of it to Mexico, where it's synthesized and the fentanyl winds up on the streets of the United States. What is your assessment of progress or a lack of progress that's been made on China living up to its commitment, which were reinforced at a bilateral meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi, to crack down on fentanyl precursor exports?
So while I welcomed your delegation's visit, we were excited to see the fact that you were there to provide some more pressure, and the San Francisco summit between Presidents Biden and Xi. There were some small incremental steps, but we have yet to see what is going to come of it. I'm in the trust but verify camp, and more importantly, nothing happens in China without the CCP knowing. So there are some arguments that, oh, they can't control the big pharmaceuticals or the big chemical companies are known. It's more the smaller ones that are very hard to, there's always going to be an excuse as to why they're not enforcing. And this is where I think that we need to hold them accountable with regular, verifiable reports on law enforcement actions that they've taken, or more importantly, also for them to share with us their intel on which of the illicit fentanyl and precursor chemical companies they're looking at, and then more importantly, what actions they're taking against them. Then we also spoke earlier in the hearing about the Chinese money laundering organizations. So China makes money on both sides. So it makes money through the precursor chemicals and the fentanyl it sells to the Mexican cartels and others. But then also they're making 1% to 2% on the money that they're laundering, which are US dollars that are very precious to the Chinese who have very limited access to hard currency. So there's not really this interest. Perhaps there's a diplomatic interest because they've been shamed into a corner to make it look like they are playing ball with us. But I think we have to hold them to account much more. And it's only been the first meeting was in late January of the new joint kind of working group on fentanyl. But whether it's quarterly or every month even to see what actions they've taken, that's the question I have as to how true the commitment is, not by word, but by action.
Thank you, Professor. And Mr. Urban, on a bipartisan basis here in the Senate and in the administration, there's a strong will to sustain that pressure on the People's Republic of China to end the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals to our hemisphere and anywhere in the world. Were China to live up to its obligations to end that export business, from what other sources in the world do you expect the gap in the market might be filled?
Sure. So if the Chinese chemical companies were no longer a source of supply for the Mexican cartels, I think the first place they would go is India. I think they would source India as a possible place for their chemicals. If the Chinese lived up to this agreement, I think as the Mexican cartels had to adapt to a different source of supply, whether it be India, Eastern Europe, or another Asian country, it would present investigative opportunities because these are other places where we have joint relationships and work with those other countries like India and on ongoing investigative matters. So that would be the first place I would look for the Mexican cartels to go to.
Well, I'll ask my office to place an inquiry with DHS and DOJ to ascertain whether current law enforcement cooperation relationships are postured to begin those investigations or augment what investigations are already underway now. To what extent are we seeing supply entering the market from sources other than China at this moment?
To my knowledge, there aren't any. The Chinese are still the primary precursors chemical suppliers to the Mexican cartels. That has not changed yet. And there's not intelligence that certainly I'm aware of that indicates that the Mexican cartels are seeking other sources of supply, significant other sources of supply for those chemicals.
Professor, please characterize rest of world demand and consumption.
Fentanyl itself, the U.S. and China and Canada are still the primary consumers of illicit fentanyl, and that's why the rate of deaths are so dramatic in our two countries. We're starting to see, so there's two ways we look at fentanyl. There is legitimate fentanyl that's diverted. These are the ones that you've heard about, stolen from hospitals or someone who actually takes it from the supply chain that's legitimate. Then the one that we're looking at in our hearing today is illicit fentanyl. So I spend a lot of time working in Latin America, so it's obviously in Mexico, but we are starting to see reports of fentanyl being intercepted in Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama was a diversion case, and Colombia. And I work a lot in Colombia, where we're starting to see fentanyl-laced and other synthetic drugs start to appear. Post-COVID, all the discotheques and bars have reopened, which is the point of sale for a lot of these kind of drugs. And we've actually seen the Colombians start to ask for increased awareness and training on how to handle synthetic drugs. And also, you know that Colombia still continues to be the top producer of cocaine that also need precursor chemicals that also come from China. And these are the things that we're looking at. And the other day, on Friday, Secretary Blinken was at the UN in Vienna on a global meeting, basically warning that this fentanyl crisis is coming your way. A lot of it is because there's underreporting, and then more importantly, people don't recognize what a fentanyl overdose looks like. Here in the US, we actually have access to Narcan, and there are ways that the numbers are so high because we're tracking the numbers. Other countries don't necessarily commit a death to an autopsy. That's why other countries that might be experiencing fentanyl-related deaths are not recording them. And the numbers are lower in Canada, I understand, because they don't test for cause of death as much as we do in the United States. But it's concerning as it grows bigger and better. And also the Europeans are expecting fentanyl to arrive for their summer season of the party goers in places like Spain and Greece.
So that was my next question, is given how addictive and lucrative this trade is, why hasn't it penetrated Europe?
It's starting now, and the bigger thing is perhaps they're not detecting it. It's kind of hard to detect because it's usually in capsule or pill format that doesn't emit the odor that the canine units that our colleagues at DEA use can detect heroin, cocaine, and marijuana that have an odor and that the dogs are trained for. So I was in Spain like 3 weeks ago where they had the first death of an adolescent, 14 years old, with what's called pink cocaine, which is actually a synthetic drug. And now the Spanish are trying to figure out who are the traffickers that brought it there. And we do know that the Mexican cartels are trafficking not just in cocaine, but maybe starting to bring those fentanyl-laced pills as well to a European market. As I mentioned earlier, it costs about 30 cents for these pills to be produced in a lab in Mexico. It's being sold on the streets here in front of Nats Stadium at $15 to $20 for that same pill. Extremely lucrative.
So what is the flow from precursor production to fentanyl production, to trafficking and sale in Europe? Can you map that for us, please?
It's a little bit different. The synthetics that they have in Europe are actually different drugs than what we have. Fentanyl is probably the last to enter the market. The bigger thing is because synthetics produce a much more effective high and a little bit more addictive and are easy to take because it's basically a pill. It's kind of an easier way to be introduced to drugs. And this is the part that I was trying to understand is how could you educate our partner nations about the fear that adolescents and younger people are going to be consuming the way that we do in the United States. But we probably can expect that the same exact routes that are maritime routes that are being used to push cocaine that here in the United States we don't consume compared to before are being shipped to Europe are probably the same exact maritime routes that are going to be used in order to piggyback with these synthetic drugs, including fentanyl.
Dr. Felbab-Brown, your take, please, on the rest of world market and trends in production, trafficking, sale, use, and overdose outside of the United States. I think you need to turn on your...
Sir, you have said, why hasn't it not arrived to Europe? I would phrase it, why hasn't it not yet arrived to Europe? The reality is that there are always significant gaps in drug markets. Essentially, they are a function of traffickers being interested in building a new market. in the 1980s, when the United States started experiencing the cocaine epidemic, there was plenty of coca cultivated in the Andes and plenty of cocaine produced to supply Europe. Yet traffickers were not interested in developing those routes for another decade and a half. As I have mentioned earlier, Mexican cartels are bringing up significant networks around Europe. They are both partnering with Bulgarian, Turkish, Albanian actors. They are also starting to develop methamphetamine production in Europe, in places like the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain. Some of that meth is going for sales abroad, including to Asia Pacific, but those vectors are primary possibilities for shipping cocaine and for shipping fentanyl, and more importantly, for manufacturing fentanyl in Europe. It's also very possible that Chinese actors will be selling either finished fentanyl or other synthetic opioids or their precursors to actors within Europe. So in my view, it's a matter of time before it does hit in Europe, and in a matter of time where traffickers will seek to penetrate highly valuable markets in Australia, New Zealand, Japan.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I was just getting started. One more question, if I might, which is just the bipartisan border security measure co-authored by a member of the subcommittee, Senator Langford, included some provisions to substantially augment our capacity to detect, interdict, and stop fentanyl flows into the U.S. The story of that legislation is well known. Congressional Republicans stopped it in its tracks at the cynical and politically motivated request of the former president. I introduced some legislation last week as a potential stopgap measure to surge fentanyl detection equipment and technology to the southern border. I know, Mr. Urban, that you've touched on the importance of detection technology, technical advances in detection technology during your testimony today. But can you just comment for a moment on what more you think can be achieved if we field sufficient and more sophisticated detection technology at ports of entry?
So ports of entry, obviously we want to detect the fentanyl before it comes in and is dispersed throughout the United States for sale. So the more resources you can surge at the border and ports of entry in order to detect with more sophisticated equipment that's needed, it'll benefit everyone in law enforcement. The second part of this is in terms of equipment that you would push out to the field within the United States. Your investigator narcotics unit needs those detectors so we can efficiently identify the fentanyl to protect the officer, to protect the public. So the more equipment that's being pushed out is a benefit to everybody in terms of efficiently moving forward with investigations and protecting officers as they deal with the threat.
Thank you, Mr. Urban. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, and thank you all. I have a few more questions, and because I had to leave to go vote, there may be a little bit of overlap, so I apologize if you have covered it in my absence. But let me start. This is a question really to all of you. In recent years, there's been an increase in the number of Mexican youth dying from fentanyl overdoses, and you've mentioned that. The new domestic impact of the fentanyl crisis may increase the willingness of Mexican leaders to cooperate with U.S. law enforcement in our efforts to stop fentanyl trafficking. What steps can Congress take now to ensure that our federal law enforcement has the tools and authorities that it needs so that it's ready to cooperate perhaps with a newly cooperative Mexican government in combating fentanyl? And we'll start with you, Dr. Felbab-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the most important issue is really to work on will of the Mexican government to cooperate. There are plenty of opportunities for cooperation if that will is resurrected. Currently, it's very weak. How we get to resurrecting the will, certainly improving non-intrusive border inspection is an important element, but I would advocate also improving or strengthening even intrusive border inspections. That is economically painful, but 100,000 Americans dying, it's far more painful. The cost of the fentanyl crisis is well over $2 trillion at this point. So intrusive inspection is something that the Mexican government will start paying attention to. Indictment portfolios of Mexican government officials collaborate with cartels or who subvert law enforcement efforts to jointly collaborate are also very important. And there might be a time where considering the FTO designation, Foreign Terrorist Organization designation against the cartels might become appropriate as well. I would also say, though, that on the U.S. side, we should be expanding both intelligence collections on Mexican cartels, prioritize them higher in the collections priorities list, as well as expand the frequency, the extent of organized crime drug task forces. They are very powerful, very effective, and they need to look at all aspects of the cartel's activities, not simply fentanyl, because their expansion into legal economies, their expansion into wildlife trafficking, their expansion into water distribution, all feed their economic power, their smuggling networks, and their political power within Mexico.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Real. Yuya.
Just to complement what Wanda has said, so there's an anticipation, as you know, there's going to be a new president of Mexico in the next coming months. And we hope that person will be, whoever it is, it's going to be a female for the first time, is more pragmatic. But it also is an opportunity in their first 100 days for the U.S. to exert pressure and actually exact from them cooperation on the counter-narcotics front. That could be partnered with, as I mentioned, if they don't play ball, we should actually think about imposing tariffs, because we are their greatest trading partner, and ways that you can actually put together the instruments of national power beyond the law enforcement and military aspect, but include those economic and trade pieces with the USMCA. The other piece we need to take a look at is how we can get them to collaborate. There's a National Security Act that was passed under AMLO that is extremely cumbersome for American law enforcement officials to work with actionable intelligence with their counterparts. So through diplomatic means, there should be a way to reverse that, and more importantly, get more boots on the ground in order to go after. We know where the labs are, we know who the heads are, and more importantly, it's just a question of action and political will on the Mexican side. So the change of government could be an opportune moment, but we would have to encourage policymakers to act quickly to show what the carrots and sticks are in terms of getting movement to dismantle the Mexican cartels.
Thank you, Mr. Urban.
So it's a real opportunity. As the national security law that my fellow panelists just mentioned really set back law enforcement engagement with U.S. and Mexico decades. So we need a complete reset. The opportunities exist with vetted units. We need to establish this relationship through law enforcement, judicial process, because as I said before, Mexico is our neighbor, they're an ally, we have tremendous trade. We need to establish a relationship that goes forward well into the future with this collaborative relationship to go after transnational organized crime. So reestablishing vetted units. We went from 120 to less than 20 vetted unit members after this national security law. We need to get back to 200. Extraditions, we have a treaty, they should be done tomorrow. As soon as we ask for an extradition, it should be done in a timely manner. And the same thing will happen in Mexico that when we did in Plan Colombia. When we brought AUC and the FARC to justice, they essentially capitulated, and that's how that essentially Plan Colombia was a success. We need to establish joint investigative teams. That's a concept that happened in Europe where we put together Mexican liaison officers with U.S. law enforcement. Again, we're going to collaborate well into the future. That's not going to change. Lastly, a sanctions task force, and I have to bring up federal agents in Mexico do not have diplomatic immunity. That is absolutely absurd, and to move forward, they need to have be established with diplomatic immunity. Within the U.S., you need to increase funding. You need to have legislation that allows federal law enforcement to wiretap encrypted applications. Data targeting is another component that you could really leverage against the Mexican cartels and Chinese money launderers. There's funding that's specifically needed for that.
Okay, thank you. That is very helpful. I want to follow up a little on that. To make sure that the federal government is focused on targeting and dismantling the criminal organizations that manufacture and transport fentanyl, as well as those who support these groups through money laundering, how would prioritizing cartels and transnational criminal organizations as a target for our intelligence community improve our federal law enforcement's capacity to disrupt these entities? Yeah, sorry, Mr. Urban.
Yeah, so the intelligence community has tremendous resources and insight and data tanks.
Yeah.
We should be using all of that collaboratively with U.S. law enforcement to target these organizations. It's an untapped resource, and it should be used much more robustly as we go after the Mexican cartels and Chinese money launderers.
Okay, thank you. To Ms. Reulla, U.S. law enforcement is seeing an uptick in fentanyl precursor shipments that originate in India. How will transnational criminal organizations adapt and change their practices if U.S., Chinese, and Mexican officials begin cracking down on illicit trafficking in their own countries more aggressively?
And that was brought up by Senator Ossoff. So we were looking at how it's like a balloon effect, right? So if we actually stop and lower the access to Chinese precursors, it's going to go to India. But India is a much more reliable partner. So, and I know that there are already talks about the kind of morphing of the supply chain with our Indian counterparts. So that's actually a promising area where we'd be able to more easily set up joint investigative task forces with a more willing partner than necessarily with Mexico or with China. But remember, these groups are so agile and so innovative. And there have been talks about them producing their own chemicals in Mexico as well, which we should kind of put in there as an option. But they have a great thing going now, and it's very hard to stop this flow that's coming from China. And the business is so lucrative, it's very hard for anyone to turn away from some product that has tremendous profit margin, more lucrative than any other product right now in the world.
Thank you. Dr. Felbab-Brown, in 2021, President Biden created the Council on Transnational Organized Crime to centralize resources from across the federal government that are dedicated to countering transnational criminal organizations. What has the council accomplished so far, if anything?
I think establishing the council was a great idea, but to my knowledge, the council has not had even one meeting.
Okay. Could the U.S. better leverage existing organizations such as the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to disrupt these sophisticated criminal groups?
Yes, absolutely. Elevating financial intelligence, both for the purpose of seizing money, but also for the purpose of building network picture and being able to mount arrests and prosecution is crucial. I think there are great opportunities to break down still very strong existing stovepiping among law enforcement agencies, bring in more departments, think about utilizing wildlife crime investigators, because both Chinese and Mexican criminal networks are often deeply implicated in wildlife trafficking, and the level of hiding, the level of obstruction they put for law enforcement in that domain is often far weaker than in other domains. So focusing on that element will have potentially high payoffs in terms of detecting other parts of the network. So I think there are very significant opportunities to truly move to a whole-of-government approach on the U.S. side, and not simply against fentanyl flows, but against the networks that smuggle fentanyl, including their political and government protectors.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all three of you for joining us today in this discussion. Before the hearing ends, I want to give each of you a chance to highlight any areas of international counter-fentanyl efforts that we didn't cover today. If you think we've covered everything you wanted to say, just say so. But I always like to give people the opportunity, and we'll start with you, Mr. Urban.
So I think we've certainly covered Mexico and China. I
Yeah.
do think there's two components. One is international cooperation with countries in Asia that don't have a fentanyl problem, but have a Chinese organized crime problem that could be allies and ours with us in this fight. So you have Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Australia. All those countries, we could increase resources in terms of our collaboration with law enforcement, and it would benefit us in terms of attacking Chinese organized crime. The second one, we didn't talk a lot about what we can do within the United States, but I do think going after Chinese money launderers using the racketeering laws, diminishing the ability of the use of WeChat for Chinese money launderers would be a dramatic improvement. And the last part is data targeting that we've talked about here in terms of bringing all the data together to go after the cartels with target packages.
Thank you. Excuse me, Ms. Reulla.
So just to compliment my co-witnesses, I think the real issue still goes back to demand. We didn't cover it as much in the US, but why does this market exist? Because of the demand.
Right.
And we have to educate. We are one of the most educated populations in the world. It is a shame that we have so many young people dying from the scourge of fentanyl poisonings.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? And then more importantly, we didn't really talk about it. The social media platforms are the means by which this addiction and more importantly, the euphoria and the attraction of synthetic drugs, including fentanyl-laced drugs, are creating the market. And also that's how they basically push the product. And I think in collaboration across all the agencies, we have to do a better collection of data of how these networks are interrelated, and then more importantly, use all the force of the U.S. government in terms of our law enforcement intelligence agencies to break down the networks. There are specific nodes, and I still go back to it's all about the money. The Sinaloa cartel, we've have all the Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo and El Chapo under indictment or imprisoned and extradited, but we've still never captured the financier. So, and it's very difficult to basically replace a financier compared to all the other ones who are running the different networks. So still going after the money, but also try to deal with that demand side, and then the enablers, which are literally the social media platforms that are seducing our young into becoming, sadly, users of such a deadly drug.
Thank you. And Dr. Felbab-Brown.
Among the issues that we touch on is India. I think that it's important to continue building cooperation. The Biden administration has been doing so, but we have to realize that law enforcement in India, particularly counter-narcotics law enforcement, is very weak. The pharmaceutical industry is very powerful, yet subject to minimal regulations and their enforcement. India is already a significant supplier of synthetic drugs globally. So important opportunity to build this relationship, but a very long road as to what needs to happen. There are also significant opportunities to be engaging with our European partners on synthetic drugs broadly and fentanyl and synthetic opioids specifically. They tend to be some of the most trusted partners with whom we have the most robust relationships, and they are very useful as Mexican cartels are expanding their operations significantly in Europe and in other parts of the world. Synthetic drugs, specifically synthetic opioids, fentanyl, nitazines, are very different than other drugs because of the price per potency ratio, but also because they are driven by supply. This is not what customers are asking for, at least not in the initial stages. It's not that one day users in the United States started asking for fentanyl. It's not that one day users in Britain have started asking for nitazines. It's because it's driven by supply. Yeah. And hence the importance of holding hearings like you just did, Chair Hassan, and focusing on expanding cooperation against supply.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for spending so much time and care with us this afternoon. To Dr. Felbab-Brown, to Ms. Raya, and Mr. Urban, your testimony today has made a real difference, and it's a real contribution to our nation's security. I thought this was a fruitful discussion. We have a lot of new ideas that you've all identified and some new problems to solve. This hearing record will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on April 4th for submissions of statements and questions for the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.